75 years after the establishment of the United Nations to, quote, save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, has the UN lived up to its ideals? Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. The United Nations marks its 75th anniversary this year. The organization has faced many crises over its three-quarter-century-long history. But this September, because of the pandemic, the annual session of the General Assembly won't be held at UN headquarters. Instead of flying to New York for this ritual, heads of state and government will deliver their speeches online under the theme Reaffirming Our Collective Commitment to Multilateralism. With growing trends towards isolationism and unilateralism in some parts of the world, including the host country, the United States, will this amount to little more than diplomatic talk? We will be joined in just a few moments by the President of the General Assembly. But first, we take a look back at some of the UN's key challenges and achievements over the last 75 years.
50 United Nations have been working for 8 weeks to produce a charter on which the future of world peace will depend.
Let us not fail to grasp this supreme chance to establish a worldwide rule of reason.
Saudi Arabia? No. Soviet Union? Yes. United Kingdom? Abstain. United States? Yes.
Tis a declaration of basic principles of human rights and freedoms.
Dag Hammarskjöld, I wish you from the bottom of my heart welcome to New York and to the United Nations headquarters. You are going to take over the most impossible job on earth.
We could have done much more. We should have done much more.
I was relieved that the Council did not give approval for the war. It would have been a disaster.
This agreement represents the best chance we've had to save the one planet that we've got.
So then, can the UN save the planet from self-destruction, from the perils of poverty, hunger, war, and climate change? Will it perpetuate the power of the 5 permanent members of its Security Council, the major powers that defeated Germany and Japan and their allies during World War II? Or will it advance the common interests of its other 188 member states? Joining us now is the President of the 74th session of the General Assembly, Ambassador Tijjani Muhammed-Bande of Nigeria. President Bande, despite the many challenges and setbacks the organization has faced over the years, millions of people around the world still place their trust and their hopes in the United Nations. But has the organization lived up to people's expectations?
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for having me. There is no question that the United Nations has been a force for good in the world. And living up to expectations, not fully, precisely, is an organization that occasionally struggles with delivery. But you look at the big questions concerning setting of norms, you see that without the United Nations, our situation would have been far worse. And therefore, in terms of expectations, by and large, the United Nations is still the last hope of ordinary people around the world. And yes, there have been mistakes, but to your question directly, it is still the organization to come to for solving global problems.
But has the UN, do you feel, learned from its past mistakes? When you look back on the challenges the UN has faced over the last 12 months during your presidency of the General Assembly, how do you see the role of the UN moving forward? Is this a weakened, out-of-date organization, or is it still indispensable?
Well, the first element of the question, the UN has learned. It's an organization that actually is structured to learn. I mean, when you look at, for example, the failure from the perspective of Africa and its friends of the situation in Rwanda, you now see there's a lot more concern and focus on prevention. The very idea that prevention is key. I think that is something that is a lesson learned. But in terms of other matters, look at the issue of poverty eradication. The very idea that the global community will come together and say, north or south, rich or poor, poverty eradication is a major goal. Among the 17 goals, all the goals are important. So yes, it has delivered on the basic questions of where humanity should go. I think that is critical.
But has it really delivered on its commitments? The UN successes, as you know, over the last few years have been few and far between. The Paris Climate Accord was a promising moment, but at the end of the day, does it all amount to little more than a photo op, a talk shop with great ideas and commitments, but very little concrete action?
Well, I don't think that is borne out by the fact and the momentum. Obviously, we weren't happy that in Madrid we didn't get what we wanted, but look at the larger picture. There is far more focus on climate issues around the world, including even in countries that have questions concerning the direction. But ordinary people take the issue of climate very, very seriously. And the very fact that the young youth all over the world have taken it as important tells you that we have achieved in getting people to come to this. And the commitments are actually being made.
But does the UN, do you think, need to reform itself to better reflect the geopolitical reality of the world today?
The UN is reforming itself in so many ways. Some of the ways are not well known because they do not pertain more directly to council. The one that is most talked about around the world, and this I know, wherever I go, people ask, how can we have a democratic organization in this century where 5 members can have exercise of veto? This is the process that we are already undergoing as an assembly. We have not made much progress this year because of the nature of the negotiations, the informal setting, and the requirement for in-person meeting, which didn't happen.
So then can the UN ever be efficient if it is at the mercy of the veto of the 5 permanent members in the Security Council?
You see, any organization that is open to a veto of 1 member only can be open to difficulties. And the United Nations have been open to difficulties, including in areas that there is urgent requirement relating to peace matters around not only the Middle East, but around the world. This is an issue that is discussed every day. The reform of the Council has been slow, but the United Nations is not just the Security Council. And the Security Council does not mean that other elements of norm setting, other elements of negotiations are not important.
And we also saw the inaction of the Council, the way it's been paralyzed because of the different dynamics and competing interests of some of these 5 permanent member states. Its inaction in Syria and Yemen, but also its lateness in doing anything, its tardiness in addressing the global pandemic. How challenging was it for you to preside over the GA at a time when the US and others are becoming more isolationist? Should the UN have led global efforts to fight the pandemic? Was it, do you think, a missed opportunity? And is the UN then in danger of losing its sense of purpose?
In terms of work during the pandemic, all countries have appreciated the difficulties we are under, and it has not been as easy as would have been the case to negotiate issues. But one, there is recognition of the necessity to work together. And there have been resolutions that have been passed in support of all countries relating to development of vaccines, their availability, should they be produced, and general questions of commitment to help countries that are in distress.
Do you seriously believe that the UN is fit for purpose, or is simply what many people have said it is over the last few years, a relic of that post-World War II era? It's a question a lot of people have been asking. Does it exist to save the world from war and all these other evils, to safeguard international law, or simply to perpetuate and expand the power of a handful of nations? And I wonder, as you stand close to handing over your authority as President of the General Assembly to your successor, what do you think his top priority can and should be?
I think his top priority, to start with that question, is really dealing with the fallout of the pandemic. He has said so, and I think this is a very wise thing to do. But back to the question, the United Nations is an organization that has served us for 75 years, that it is still standing and has been able to prevent large-scale war of the nature that we have seen in the First and Second World Wars, I think speaks to it in terms of its ability to talk of big questions concerning human rights. It is the one organization that has mainstream rights and the whole idea of equality of men and women, and the issue of non-discrimination. These are big questions that go beyond simply matters of war and peace. 75 years on, we are still having a United Nations. Countries refer to it. Everybody comes to say what they feel it should mean to them and how they contribute to its development.
An important organization, as you say, in need of reform. President of the 74th session of the UN General Assembly, President Tijjani Muhammed-Bande of Nigeria. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much indeed.
Now, although there are 193 members of the United Nations, it is the 15 members of the Security Council who make critical decisions on global peace and security. But the reality is worse. It is the permanent 5 members of the Council, China, France, Russia, the UK and the US, who effectively call the shots. Since 1948, the UN has deployed more than 70 peacekeeping operations. Today, about 90,000 UN Blue Helmets and police officers are deployed in 13 UN peacekeeping operations, some as old as the United Nations itself. The UN has been involved in today's Democratic Republic of the Congo since the 60s. Its peacekeeping mission has been active since 1999. We traveled to Kinshasa, the capital of the DRC, to hear a view of the mission, known by its French acronym, MONUSCO.
Les conflits en RDC ont apporté beaucoup de maux, notamment celui du kidnapping. Ce vent de kidnapping a vraiment ravagé la partie est de la République démocratique du Congo. J'en ai été victime d'ailleurs, pas que moi, mais aussi j'ai eu des amis qui en sont victimes. Moi, personnellement, j'ai fait plus de 2 jours dans la forêt. Et là, je ne peux pas, c'est difficile même à raconter. Pourquoi? Parce que j'ai été traumatisé de toute ma vie. La MONUSCO est venue en RDC pour résoudre les problèmes, les conflits armés. La mission des Nations Unies en RDC n'a pas été effective. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, dans les milieux où les Nations Unies se sont établies, il y a toujours des guerres, il y a toujours des violences sexuelles à répétition. Il y a même le désespoir des familles qui, après la crise non maîtrisée par les forces armées, par la MONUSCO en collaboration avec le gouvernement, cette crise fait en sorte que la jeunesse perde plusieurs valeurs. Moi, personnellement, j'ai eu même des amis qui ont adhéré au groupe rebelle en se disant qu'il n'y avait plus d'espoir. Les Nations Unies, avant de renouveler leur contrat, devraient peut-être changer, reformer leur structure organisationnelle en changeant cette structure qui est celle qui sera peut-être celle de s'impliquer entièrement et de montrer à la population qu'elle s'implique dans leur vie. J'espère qu'après une réforme, elle sera peut-être prise au sérieux. Ou soit aussi, si les Nations Unies se disent s'impliquer, qu'elles fassent même une bonne communication avec la population. Peut-être que la population ne comprend pas son implication. Peut-être que la population n'a aucune idée de la mission précise, de la mission des Nations Unies.
So has the UN failed in its mission to bring lasting peace to the DRC? Can it save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, as it vowed to do 75 years ago? Joining me now from New Delhi is Shashi Tharoor. He was a career senior UN official, a close advisor to the late Kofi Annan when he served as head of the Department of Peacekeeping and as Secretary General, and he was himself a candidate to succeed him as Secretary General in 2006. A former Minister of State for External Affairs of India, he is since 2009 a prominent member of Parliament for the Congress Party. Shashi Tharoor, the UN has had some successes in the last few years, but as you know, its reputation has also suffered quite a great deal over the last few decades. As a former Under-Secretary General for Public Information, do you see this as poor UN communication, or is it simply that the UN has lost its appeal, lost its luster, and many would argue its credibility, not just in the DRC, but in other places like Cyprus, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Western Sahara, Palestine, and the list is really long. Some of these conflicts had already, in fact, began when you started your career with the UN in the late 70s.
That's so true, Gita, and it's a long list. But you know, the UN reflects the realities of world politics, even while it seeks to transcend them. The UN at its best and its worst is a mirror of the world. It reflects our differences and our convergences, our hopes and aspirations, as well as our limitations and failures. But the point is that to reduce it either to just a communications problem or a credibility problem, I think begs the entire question of how the UN is structured. It's the member states who run the organization.
Even if that is the case, Shashi Tharoor, I mean, it is a rather classic rebuttal, isn't it, to pin all of the failings of the UN on its member states, on the Security Council, on the permanent 5 members, isn't it?
Yeah, but it happens to be true. So if, for example, you need troops to enforce the Security Council's will in any of that long list of places you're mentioning, Gita, in every one of those cases, it's the member states who decide whether to do it, what the mandate will be, how it will be crafted, how many troops they're willing to pay for to send there, who's going to give those troops. So at the end of the day, if member states don't provide all of this, the UN has absolutely nothing of its own to do. So when you speak of the UN, remember the UN is both a stage and an actor. I think that's the most helpful metaphor. It's a stage on which the member states are playing their parts and making the decisions. And then you're sending out one actor, the Secretary General, to do things.
Hold on, but the Secretary General does have...
the
actor, but he does have a very important role to play, doesn't he? Kofi Annan used to joke, as you know, that SG doesn't stand for Secretary General, but for scapegoat. But it's also true that Secretaries General too often hide behind member states, behind the Security Council. In fact, a lot of them self-censure for fear of reprisals by the P5s. They rarely speak out when it's controversial. I mean, we see that time and again, don't we? When did we see bold leadership from Ban Ki-moon or heard from the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres? The US is lacking leadership, would you agree?
I don't want to characterize individuals simply because having been there for so long, I think anything I say would look like whatever. I've always been very aware that our great second Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, told us very memorably the UN was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. And sometimes that's the best the UN can do, to try and prevent us all from tumbling into hell. It's a worthwhile battle the UN is waging, but the world tends to judge it by standards it's impossible for any UN Secretary General to achieve. Now, you know, when you talk about, for example, the fact that some Secretary General are usually silent, that they don't speak, particularly when by speaking they might offend powerful member states. If you ask the question, why is that so? Kofi Annan had a superb answer when I was working with him. He said, there's an old Ghanaian proverb that my father taught me. He said, never hit a man on the head when you have your fingers between his teeth. I think that's a very memorable way of putting it. A Secretary General has 10 different issues he needs to be on the right side of the key powers that are helping him deliver results. Now, if he's going to hit them on the head on one issue, there are 9 other things impacting millions of people around the world where he might lose their cooperation.
But there's one issue that we've been hearing about for decades. We've been hearing about Security Council reform for a long time. In fact, the last push for reform of the Council was by Annan 20 years ago, and it's been silence pretty much ever since. Can you see the day when there will be enough momentum to compel all the P5s to accept meaningful reform, enlargement of the Council to be more representative, abolishing the veto, or simply implementing, in fact, something that is already in the Charter, that powers on the Council recuse themselves when they are stakeholders or a party to a conflict?
As you know, they've never done that. And the irony about this is that power structures are rarely changed voluntarily. You need the world to make it impossible for a certain power structure to continue. We saw this in the World Bank and the IMF when the sheer pressure of the economic transformation of China meant they had to change their established power structure. Belgium had the same weighted vote as China did. Now, in peace and security, that isn't yet the case. So you've got countries like Germany, Japan, India, South Africa, Brazil, saying we are now as indispensable to keeping the UN going around the world as the permanent 5, so why shouldn't we be permanent members too? But the resistance is colossal, and the resistance is not only from the entrenched interests of the permanent 5, it's also from those countries that feel resentful of others joining this exclusive club. You mentioned Kofi Annan 20 years ago. I remember Boutros Ghali 25 years ago in saying that at the 50th anniversary of the UN, he wanted to see Security Council reform done and dusted. And now we're coming up to the 75th anniversary. And what is worse, of course, there's nothing in prospect even by the 80th. But the truth is that the UN has responded to the world's demands upon the huge multidimensional peacekeeping operations that I was privileged to be a part of. At my peak, I had 80,000 soldiers working for us around the world in the field. I've seen human rights becoming a subject that no member state wanted to touch into something that was absolutely core to the UN's behavior. Therefore, there is absolutely no question that the United Nations has been a highly adaptable institution that has evolved in response to changing times, and it can therefore adapt again. You know, reform means
you say highly.
People.
Well, when you say highly adaptable,
is,
you say highly adaptable. Many people would actually vehemently disagree with you. In fact, it has shown that it's also been reluctant to adapt to a changing world. What do you think should be the UN's top priority moving forward now, as it attempts to, again, remain relevant in a world where multilateralism is under threat? It's the entire multilateral architecture that is under threat, isn't it? When you have the US withdrawing from WHO in the midst of a devastating pandemic, reneging on its climate change commitments, withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal, where are we as an international system headed?
Well,
with right-wing divisive policies, I should add, that are gaining popularity not just here in the United States or in Europe, but even in your own country, India.
You put your finger on it, Gita. I think India is not a problem. India is still committed to the international multilateral approaches for the most part. But when it comes to what we've seen because of coronavirus, there is a general retrenchment. There are countries saying that they want to be more self-reliant, more protectionist. You're seeing the pulling back of international supply chains and production chains. Deglobalization is a new buzzword. And I do fear, very frankly, that I think multilateralism could be a casualty of COVID as well. And this is something which there's no easy answers to, because a lot depends on member states. When the US decided to pull out of WHO, it sent an ominous signal that essentially it no longer valued the incredibly indispensable ways, for example, in which the WHO has led the tackling of global disease and pandemics like this one. What I am concerned about with multilateralism is, will this tendency to be more protectionist, more nationalist, more into import substitution and all of that, will this translate itself into saying we don't need to cooperate with other member states? If that happens, it will undermine this magnificent experiment of 75 years. If tribalism, nationalism, isolationism are allowed to succeed and prosper, if the post-COVID world will be a world in which people say our sovereign states are so much more important than what any international cooperation will get us, then I really worry about the future.
All right, Shashi Tharoor, many thanks for joining us. A pleasure to speak to you as always. Thank you.
Thank you, Gita.
And so as the UN holds its 75th session of the General Assembly, it faces serious questions about its future, its ability to reform and be the relevant and central intergovernmental organization it once was. Will it display leadership and uphold the principles of its charter in a rapidly changing world? With international cooperation, its fundamental pillar and raison d'être, under increasing attack by some of its powerful members, the UN will have to convince an already skeptical public that it can still reinvent itself and live up to its original promise to protect the interests of all nations and the rights of all peoples, and not just cater to a handful of member states. That its leadership, its Secretary General, can speak truth to power and be the true custodian and defender of the Charter of the United Nations. From me, Rida Fakhri, and the team, thanks for watching. See you next time.